often say to people, if you want to chop off at the knees a culture of feedback, not just in a workplace, in a family dynamic amongst friends, the best way to annihilate that culture is to defend, blame and justify when someone challenges you with some, perhaps some home truths. I get stuff, Joe, how would you know? You don't know how hard it is. You don't know what it's been like. We're packing up to move house at the moment. Couldn't you have picked a better time? The likelihood of you wanting to take the courage to give me feedback next time is probably going to be diminished, quite a lot if I respond in that way.
This week I sat down with Peter Muling from Ethical Leaders. Peter is all about flipping feedback on its head, and that with the right approach to feedback, every interaction can be positive. We talked about the blue triangle, how to prepare a culture of feedback, and his new book, The Power of Triangles. This episode is perfect for anyone who works in a team, as there are some great practical takeaways throughout. Let me know what you think, and if you've tried any of these approaches. As always, enjoy this episode of It's Never About Money. Hi, Pete. How you doing?
Better now for being in your joke.
That's kind. That's kind. I'm glad you're on. Somebody definitely that I've wanted to get on for a little while, and I always start because I think people will often want to know a little bit more, and as a start around your family, a little bit about you as an individual to begin with, and perhaps you can give our listeners a little bit of a three-dimensional view of Pete Muling.
Sure. So if I go way back, I'm one of 6 children to Betty and Gil. Gil's still with us. He's 92. He's a 1928 model, as he says.
That's amazing.
And thanks to Gil, all of his family, 6 children and multiple grandchildren and great-grandchildren all barrack for the Hawthorn Football Club. So that's an important thing to get through.
So you'd call that a favourable thing?
Well, we are known as the family club, Joe. But, so I married in 1986, which was a premiership year. Married my beloved wife, Ondina. So in August, we're coming up to 35 years of marriage. We've got 4 children. Alicia, people may recognise if they watch Channel 9 Sport on the news. So Alicia Muling, sports journalist. Our youngest daughter, George, is 24 and she's finishing off her teaching degree this year in primary school education. And then we've got 2 boys in the middle. Adam's 26, he's a chippy. And Josh is turning 30 next week, I think, or in a couple of weeks' time. And he's a secondary school teacher, so he followed in the footsteps of his old man. He's a phys ed teacher. And that was my gig for nearly 30 years. So I was a secondary PE teacher, spent my last sort of nearly 10 years in senior leadership as a campus principal. Had a bit of a bizarre sideways movement for 5 years where I was a dean at Mannix College, which is a university residential college affiliated with Monash Uni. So I was a live-in dean there. And 2 years ago at Easter, I took the plunge and went off and started my own leadership consultancy.
So it sounds like, by the family dynamics that, feedback and having conversations would be something that you'd be doing just ordinarily within the family. But then obviously being in senior leadership positions in education sort of has given you that exposure to, having difficult, potentially and challenging conversations.
Look, it's a really interesting one, Joe. I don't know how true this is. I don't have any research to back it up. But I was talking with a friend, Dan McPherson, Dan is the senior cameraman with Channel 9. And I was talking with him one day were doing some filming outside their studios in the Docklands, and I said to Dan, look, I reckon if you looked around all of these offices, this was pre-COVID when offices were full, I said, I'm just not sure how many of ththose challenging conversations really do happen.
Yeah, at the moment. Yeah.
And in my experience, at work, I mean, even when I was in senior leadership, I was guilty as charged of often avoiding some of those really difficult conversations because of, the emotions at play. And in fact, even amongst my family, and I think it's pretty common in families, often some of those sensitive areas often go unchallenged. Having said that, by virtue of what I have been exposed to, I've been fortunate that some of those conversations have been happening more frequently within my own family, with Ondina and my kids, as well as my siblings. And whilst they're tough, invariably, in fact, I can't think of any instances where when you do have those conversations from a spirit of support, genuine support and care, I'd actually say love. I mean, the term tough love, I think, very much applies. People ultimately appreciate it because I've never known sweeping stuff under the carpet to actually solve problems.
No, that sounds very, very true to me. So obviously, again, moving from those senior leadership positions in education to running your own business, how did you decide on the name Ethical Leaders for your business? And maybe you can give us a bit of a background on what it is that Ethical Leaders does.
It's interesting. I vividly remember I'm a person, unlike you, I don't have that olive skin that goes golden brown in the sun. I've spent all of my life, Joe, sitting under beach umbrellas or hibernating in shade tents on the beach.
It's what we call it. It's what we call an indoor plant,
yes.
Peter.
Yeah. Just as long as it's not too close to the window, I can still get burnt. I vividly remember sitting on the beach with Ondina inside my shade tent with a pencil and a notepad when I was trying to come up with a name for the company. We're on the beach. I think it was at Phillip Island, and just really literally doing a brainstorm of all the words that I thought seemed applicable. And ultimately one word that seemed to connect a lot of the terms that I was putting down, terms like taking responsibility and being accountable, being open, honest, integrity. The term ethical was something that seemed to perhaps act as a bit of almost an umbrella for those terms. Now, it's a bit of a risk to have your business named Ethical Leaders. It certainly puts pressure on you because it's very easy to stray away from that in terms of how you conduct yourself and the like. So what's ethics? What's ethics got to do with it? And fundamentally, you can tell the listeners this, but fundamentally, what you're doing is giving advice to businesses around how to deliver feedback within the workspace and the workplace. How does that have anything to do with ethics, do you think? Look, I think in terms of what's the, if we're talking about having those challenging conversations and giving difficult feedback, what's your motivation for it? I mean, I believe that if, and I know that I've fallen into this trap before of when you've been dealing with someone whose behaviours are problematic, they're underperforming, or their behaviours are having a negative impact on others' capacity to do their work. I think if we're motivated from a source of almost, I mean, vindictiveness is a strong word, but as human beings, we're capable of having, all sorts of thought bubbles in our head. And if my motivation to challenge you, if, you and I were working together is, well, I'm going to really show Joe who's boss here, or, I'm going to give him a swift kick up the backside. I'll talk in a calm way. I'll try and present as if I'm being professional and so forth. But if my motivation is something that I think is not, genuine and genuinely for your well-being, as well as those around us, I think that's where, the ethics of how we conduct ourselves comes in. Really, feedback is only feedback if it's delivered with a desire to help a person learn and improve. And often, it's the most challenging feedback that we receive, which really does, can lead to the greatest amount of growth.
Yep.
So I think in terms of how we conduct ourselves as leaders, anyone that's, for me, in terms of leadership, anyone who's in a position to influence others, and that leadership can be, you can play a leadership role even if you're an underling and you're providing feedback to someone that's above you. I think that how we conduct ourselves is really, really fundamental to our effectiveness and how things are ultimately received.
So Pete, we know that you've already described a few loves, that being on Dina and the Hawthorn Football Club, but one of the other loves that we know about is actually Dr. Peter Hart's work.
Yes.
And I believe it's Peter from memory.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, and I remember actually having quite a conversation with you and you showing us that sort of the triangle approach. And whilst I don't expect you to go through that now in any great detail, would you like to give us a bit of an indication of how that actually helps us understand how to deliver good feedback?
Yeah, so Peter Hart and quite a few colleagues, one in particular, Roger Dingle. So Dr. Peter Hart, he's got a PhD in psychology. Roger Dingle's a psychologist as well. In fact, a book that I'm hoping to come out soon is written with Peter and Roger. They've written an appendix for the book. Their work over several decades was all about how can we better understand the role that emotions play in the workplace in impacting our well-being, how we engage, and ultimately our performance. And if you're talking about emotions at play in any phase of life, including the workplace, there's pretty much two buckets. There's those that are negative, those that are positive, and how do we perceive the circumstances? And if we perceive them in a way where our emotional response is negative, if that then dictates how we cope with the circumstances, that can be problematic. I mean, you challenge me, we'll say, Joe, we work together and you challenge me about my performance. I interpret that, or I perceive that in a way that's highly emotional. I feel that you're, having a go at me. How dare you challenge me? I've got more experience in this particular, area than you have, and so forth. And I go into a very negative emotional space. And then my way of coping is to perhaps say, well, stuff you, and I'm going to continue doing things the way I've been doing them. I'm going to maybe, send an aggressive email to you, and I'll CC in James and others, we might say. That negative emotional response coupled with a emotional coping response, how I then behave, that sort of stuff causes problems.
How much do you think that is actually due to the actual delivery, i.e. me delivering the feedback to you, and then how much it's due to the actual recipient and the ego that may be there as well, and the inability to diffuse from that ego?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And I think it's important that we understand that. I think Peter would suggest that there's a lot of research in the field of psychology that would say that really the bulk of how we respond to our environment is dictated by our own personality and our own experiences. I mean, there's so much that makes us up as human beings. And that, you may deliver some feedback to me that, yes, it's robust and it's challenging. It's entirely legitimate. It's accurate. You're describing something that is, you've observed. But if I'm a highly emotive person, high levels of emotionality, then perhaps I do interpret it in that way. Now, having said that, if you were delivering it to me and you're pointing your finger at me in elevated voice and you're maybe making, labeling me with certain names, then that's absolutely not going to help the situation. And I think what has struck me so much about this area that I've found so interesting is it's really about trying to be more emotionally intelligent, understanding my emotions, understanding your emotions, and what can I do to try and, optimize my emotional response and also yours. So if we reversed it, if, I was delivering some feedback to you, I need to be mindful of how I do that, because there's a good chance that I might, really sort of poke you in the side and precipitate quite a negative response.
Is it true that your work is really very much focused on the delivery of feedback? And I could be incorrect here.
Yeah.
But it's more around the delivery of the feedback to an individual from a leadership position, rather than it being work on the acceptance of feedback or the way to be able to tolerate certain types of feedback. Would that be true or not?
I'll give you an answer that's yes and no, and I'll explain the yes and then the no.
Yeah.
The yes, because I think that from the point of view of delivering feedback, because of all the emotions that can be at play, and we often will want to avoid, how can I possibly do this? It's too difficult.
Mm-hmm.
How will that person cope and so forth? So my focus on the delivery is very much about trying to equip people with a skill set.
Yep.
And I'd argue that it is a skill set. I mean, a skill is something that's got clear processes that you follow. And trying to deliver it in a way where the language that you're using is influenced by what I would call a blue triangle outlook, which is about how can I support this person to be better? How can I support them to take responsibility? How can I deliver it in a way that's going to increase the chances of them being open to learning?
Yep.
And so, the subtleties of language, come into play there. How you deliver it, I often, talk about the idea of side-by-side conversations, which at least in the early stages can help with the delivery, a bit like training wheels when you're first, learning to ride a bike. Don't need to do it all the time. So very much about the skill set that's involved. A crucial part, though, is about people understanding. If they understand, let's say you've got a workplace and you've got a team of people and they all understand the notion of this blue triangle versus red triangle, that if someone comes to deliver feedback to me, I need to understand and accept and assume that this person is trying to support me. And you know what? They might not deliver in the best way
Pete,
possible.
Could you just go back like literally half a minute, because you had a bit of a internet stubble.
Sure. No worries. So in terms of the recipient, it is crucial that we understand in the feedback dynamic that you as the receiver play a key role. I mean, ultimately, are you open to learning? And if you're not open to learning, and I see, any attempt at giving feedback to me is all about someone blaming me or persecuting me, then that's not going to help. I'm not going to grow as a result. The other part that's so crucial about this is, I often say to people, if you want to chop off at the knees a culture of feedback, not just in a workplace, in a family dynamic amongst friends, the best way to annihilate that culture is to defend, blame, and justify when someone challenges you with some, perhaps some home truths. I get stuff, Joe. How would you know? You don't know how hard it is. You don't know what it's been like. We're packing up to move house at the moment. Couldn't you have picked a better time? The likelihood of you wanting to take the courage to give me feedback next time is probably going to be diminished, quite a lot if I respond in that way.
I like this idea, Peter, just generally speaking, this idea of people not having different types of processes for different contexts. So as an example, we want some authenticity in the way that we actually engage with people. So when I think about, in the office, if they actually are really adhering to a positive growth mindset around how they deliver feedback, that I would imagine that this would actually have some sort of implication to the way they would actually, run their family life. Is that true? Does the way we actually engage in the workplace with respect to things like dialogue, feedback, really then actually permeate it and move its way into the way we run our family lives? Do you think?
Look, I think it does. And the reason that I say this, I mean, I see this triangles framework, red triangle, which is all about that emotional response. We coping in an emotional way, which is very negative, often in a place of blame, victimhood, wanting to be rescued from a situation. For me, that's not just some sort of almost woody, removed theoretical framework that I can learn about that and I can apply it at work in some sort of almost robotic type way. I see it as very much about also about an outlook or a paradigm. Which way do we face? How do we see the world? I would struggle to, and I could be wrong here, but I'm just not sure whether there'd be many people who would conduct themselves at work in a way that we might consider to be blue triangle. It's all about future focus on the problem, all right? You can't change what's happened, stuff happens. Yes, our emotional response might be negative in the first instance, but let's get on, let's deal with this. Let's try and take responsibility, be accountable, be open to learning and so forth. Now with that, I think comes a sense of calmness, in how we approach things. It influences the words we use, our behaviours, our attitudes. If we're operating in that way in the workplace, and then we come home and the inevitable issues of life that unfold at home, I'm just not sure whether you'd have, it'd almost feel like a bit of a Jekyll and Hyde type.
That's what I kind of feel like. There's sort of an incongruence there between the way that you conduct yourself. And I find that sort of idea of having different almost personality traits or ways in which you deal with people depending on the circumstances would be quite taxing.
Yeah, I think there'd be, I mean, I maintain that if you're going to, the benefit for me of this framework is it really does, I think many people have articulated this, it really does help you almost hold up the selfie stick and, flip the camera and look at yourself, particularly in relation to our strong negative emotional responses, which I want to stress are absolutely normal and an important part of being human. I mean, if we're crossing the road and you see a truck coming and I don't, and you sort of put your arm out and stop me from going across, we have to, it's part of our, abilities to survive, we respond to threats and so forth. So a strong emotional response to, difficult situations is called being human, and it's normal. The real signal of are we responding in a red triangle way, emotion focused way, or a blue triangle problem focused way is how do we respond? How do we cope? What are the behaviours that we then exhibit? So yes, I remember driving home from an appointment down the Beachway, Mornington Way, and hearing that we were going into the second lockdown. And, my immediate response was negative,
yep.
Probably a few expletives, flipped out.
You're not the only one. Yep.
Yeah, and then it wasn't instantaneous. However, I then thought, well, okay, that's not going to solve anything by going into a dark cabin like that. Right, what do I need to do to respond to this? What's the problem in front of me? How do I deal with it? I think I've just digressed wildly from the question you asked me, Joe, so my apologies.
That's okay. It's all very interesting stuff. I think I'm moving really in my mind around around some practical examples of the way that you've seen businesses who have had more, let's call them, to be kind to them, more traditional ways of performance evaluation.
Yeah.
How have they actually turned things around?
One of the, I think in terms of, performance, I mean, ultimately, performance is a fluid thing, that it's we're performing day in, day out. And I think one of the problems with the whole performance review process is often it's been something that's seen as, almost like an annual event or a biannual event.
Yes.
And we have these periodic reviews, and we sit down, and it's, quite formalized and the like. One person that I've worked with, they talked about the democratization of feedback. And by that, they were saying that it wasn't just about what they've seen change. It's not just about a case of, the directors sitting down in these meetings, providing feedback about a person's, performance and how they've been going, but that the feedback was starting to happen. I don't like the word organically, because isn't that just something to do with
no? But it does make sense. This idea that you actually, your feedback is not just about one point in time, but it's happening on the ground as things are going.
Yeah, look, for me, Joe, I like sport, but I think sport provides some really good analogies.
Yeah.
Your annual performance review would almost be akin to, an elite sports coach could be an individual or a team, only providing feedback at the end of the season, or, at 2 points during the season, when during a game, there's so many opportunities for feedback to be provided about performance. And that's when the greatest learning and development occurs.
100%.
And I think in a workplace, the ultimate culture that you want as far as feedback, and this is not just the challenging conversations, this might be stuff that someone has observed that someone's genuinely doing well, and you want to reinforce that, but that it's happening most often sort of horizontally, people that are at the same level who are working with each other, but it's also happening from, a bottom up as well as a top down.
Yeah. So it's effectively what you're saying is, like, the challenge for business owners is to take this sort of very traditional, ad hoc approach, it happens kind of infrequently, to making it something that is more, again, using the word organic or sort of dynamic as the business, through the business process. It's to be able to take it and put it through the business process in that sort of way, in that sort of organic and dynamic way. Would that be right? Yeah,
it is. And for me, what's so crucial is that we have to understand that there's a constant at work all the time, in fact, in any part of life, is our emotions, positive or negative emotions. And it's those, if we can understand those emotions and what are the causes and the consequences of them, then we're in a better place to be able to go, okay, how can we try and make feedback something that's part of our culture and way of doing things? Because what gets in the way are these emotions of, perhaps fear of how will a person respond to this, or how do I actually deliver it, and so on and so forth. And if we can understand, all right, if our outlook is all about taking responsibility and trying to support learning, then we can mitigate against many of those negative emotions that either prevent us from doing it or lead to, some negative consequences if we do it in a way when our emotions are actually, perhaps elevated in a more negative way.
Mm-hmm. So if you're a fly on the wall and knowing what you do now with feedback,
yeah.
what do you think a successful business looks like?
First of all, I think part of it is knowing that you're always on the lookout for the behaviours that people are exhibiting. I mean, really, there's probably if you think of this acronym BAW, bore, I don't, is that how you spell bore, as to bore down on something, or bore? I'm not sure. But anyway, BAW, behaviours. If you've got a workplace where people are attuned to each other's behaviours, their attitudes, and by attitudes I mean, you know, how do you deliver things, the tone in your voice, you know, your mannerisms, body language, and so forth. And lastly, the words that are being used. But behaviours are absolutely the most fundamental, followed by attitudes. It's literally in an order, and words. I mean, often it's not the words that we say that are fundamental. I think we know this. It's the behaviours and the attitudes.
So can you give me some examples of the good behaviours that you'd want to see in a business that makes it
Well,
actually healthy?
I reckon one of the things that is fundamental for any workplace is to have clarity about what are the you know, expected behaviours. How do we conduct ourselves in meetings? You know, I mean, is there an expectation at meetings, for example, that do we live to that mantra or saying that if you're on time, you're late? In other words, at meetings, there's an expectation that we're here at least 5 minutes before, and we're physically, mentally prepared for that meeting. But we need to be clear about that. We don't just make assumptions that, oh, you know, if we've got a meeting starting at, you know, 9 a.m, that people are going to be there on time. We should articulate that. Clarity is a friend of feedback, because if I challenge you on something and let's say I'm your boss, but I have never been clear about some of the fundamental behaviours that I'm expecting, and then I start challenging you on a failure to meet some of those that are sitting in my head, then there's a very good chance you're going to have a negative emotional response. However, if I've been very clear about expected behaviours, if we've had a discussion about them, then I think that's so important, because if I'm talking about the importance of observing behaviours, but if you're not clear about what are the expected behaviours, that's a problem straight away.
Yep.
So I'd say that clarity is a fundamental part of any workplace, and if you're trying to mitigate against negative emotional responses, clarity all the way. Yep.
And you're a business owner. You're actually a business owner now, and you know, so in terms of the way you reflect on your own business, what does success to you look like?
On that clarity front, I mean, it's funny, people that know me, you know, they probably get a bit sick of me using that term, but it's so easy to communicate in a way where there's effectively, you know, your windscreen is foggy, and you can't see where you're going, or others can't see where you're going. For me, as a business owner, it's really, really crucial that you gain clarity about the needs and the wants of those people that you're working with. I mean, it's all about them. And if I'm going to provide, you know, something of genuine value and assistance and support for the clients that I'm working with, I need to be all about how can I understand their needs. And I think that comes under the clarity banner. You know, what are your goals? What are your objectives? You know, what are you trying to achieve? You know, perhaps is there an opportunity here where I might be able to provide you with some support? You know, there's no point in saying, yep, let's we want to go on a holiday, and I'd love to go by train. And trouble is, you just worked out that you actually want to go to Hobart.
Yeah.
Well, you know, the train's not going to help you. So I think that notion of being always starting with the end in mind, always starting with people's objectives, and that clarity. I mean, if you're going back to a work situation, and I mentioned meetings, how many times have people sat in meetings or come to the end of them and gone, what on earth was the purpose of that?
Yep.
Like, what did we just do for the last hour?
Yep. Yep. Do you think you talked previously about the pandemic and the lockdowns and
Yeah.
how things may have changed as a result of it? Do you think it strengthens your conclusions around the way businesses need to operate from a point of view of feedback, or do you think things have changed now, given that the workspaces are kind of fragmented now compared to what they were?
as I said earlier, Joe, that the ultimate purpose of feedback is to support learning.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that regardless of the circumstances that we're working under, whether people are working remotely or they're face-to-face, the people that we're employing or the people that we're working with in our teams, ultimately we want to be operating at our optimum capacity.
Yeah.
And I think, the older that we get, the more we know, we realise we don't know much at all.
Yeah.
So there's, and I know it's a, it's a bit corny, but we have to be open to learning. I mean, there's always something new to understand. How can we operate in a way that's more effective? So for me, the importance of being able to provide feedback to support development, it will never go away regardless of the circumstances that we might be working under. I think in some ways it probably makes it more difficult if we've got people working remotely, because you don't see the sort of behaviours necessarily to the same degree as what you would.
Yeah.
But at the same time, even if we are working remotely, ultimately there's some sort of outcomes that we're producing, and our performance is visible, even if it's, from the point of view of the documents we might be producing, whatever our deliverables are.
Yeah.
And I think that, it almost can make it more easy, again, to avoid those difficult conversations. Oh, well, I just can't.
Well, that's exactly what I was thinking, Pete. I was thinking, as workspaces become, there are a few more blind spots. I think if there is not a strong, culture of feedback that runs dynamically and organically, with a positive mindset, if that isn't actually there when you are actually physically in the office, it's fair to say, I reckon it's going to be easier to hide, and there'll be less feedback delivered, and there'll be probably more problems that may not be determined as quickly.
Yeah.
But are there festering away.
And I think I go back to, there are some things you can do to try and increase the chances that you will have a culture of feedback. I mentioned earlier about being clear about expected behaviours. Things such as when we do have Zoom meetings, if that's the case, that we still have a case where we say, at the end of a meeting, we actually have an observer whose role is to provide feedback about the nature of the meeting. Look, guys, thought this was spot on. The second item, we actually didn't have a clear outcome identified, and we wandered on, we waffled off, we went off at tangents. Look, Pete, you did actually arrive, 3 minutes after it started, and Joe had to go back over and, recap. That was problematic. And it's just delivered in a way that's all about, here's the behaviours that we observed, and it's being delivered for one purpose, to try and support us all to be better. The other thing too is, people, it might be the person who's chairing the meeting, saying at the end and saying, look, I was giving this presentation on this new initiative. I'd like now for some feedback on that. Was there anything that I did that you think I should repeat, for next time, or if we're going to be talking to, client X or client Y, bang, right. Anything that I should start doing, that I didn't do that would have made it more clear or more effective. And what about anything that I should have stopped doing? Mm-hmm. And by inviting feedback and being very specific about the sort of feedback that you're looking for, you actually make it easier for others to be able to deliver. Because again, emotions get in the way. Far out, how can I, tell Joe or, Mary or what have you, that I thought that, he or she was rambling on for too long. Mm-hmm. If we ask for it and invite it, we're also modeling that we're learners.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So a lot of what we've been speaking about today, which has been super interesting, is really, I believe you're developing a book. So could you tell me a little bit about that and what, people would expect to get out of reading it?
Sure. So the book, I've talked about these red and blue triangles. The
Yep.
title of the book is The Power of Triangles.
Okay.
And
as you know, I would have preferred it to be The Power of Pyramids or something like that.
Yeah. No, true. I do understand that with your background, but they're sort of at least from a two-dimensional point of view, they're triangle.
It makes sense.
Yeah. And these and it's all about the byline is optimizing emotions to enhance relationships at home and work. So it's all about this notion. These two triangles stemmed from this research that Peter Hart, Roger Dingle, and others did into this area of emotions in the workplace. How do you enhance workplace? How do you enhance performance and well-being? And these two triangles, they represent a framework, a really simple framework. Underneath it, there's an enormous amount of complexity that can help us better understand those negative emotions at play and the positive ones. How do we understand them? What are the causes? What are the consequences? And most crucially, what can we do at a practical level to try and optimize a positive emotional response of those around us ongoing, day in, day out, individuals and teams?
As you know, but in my practice, I'm very much a heavy focus on evidence-based first, empirical research, and then finding a practical solution. So what you're saying is that there is actual empirical evidence that is backing the conclusions that you're making in this particular book.
Yeah. So in the appendix, Peter and Roger, they provide actually a snapshot of the history and the theory behind this framework. The framework that I present in the book is a subset of this original framework. They call it the flourishing and languishing triangles.
Yeah.
And basically, the work that they did was both research and gaining of evidence over the course of several decades. And in that, they make reference to there's a vast body of research, and look, I think over 1 million sets of data from surveys in both corporate and the education system. And so basically, the book is my take on what I've seen, the impact that this framework can have on increasing our own capacity to understand our own emotions at play, those of others. Most importantly, what can we do at a very practical, tangible level in our workplaces, but not just there, in our lives beyond, to increase the likelihood that there'll be a positive emotional response. Because if you've got positive emotions at play, then people are going to be more productive. There's going to be less levels of distress, greater levels of engagement, higher morale in terms of enthusiasm and so forth, better capacity to be creative, productive and so forth. I mean, if we go to work and it's all about, all we're doing is our mind's in a place of, blame or victimhood or wanting to avoid circumstances, I don't know terribly many people that can operate at their best in that sort of way.
I don't know how that people, the biggest takeout for me is, how can someone operate in a positive and a growth mindset at home after they've been in a red triangle deficit mindset, with blame and victimhood and all the rest of it. It'd be very difficult to switch on and off. And so I think, really concentrating on this in the workplace might actually have a profound impact. And I'm guessing, but might have a profound impact at home as well, in terms of just your general well-being, in a sense of getting home and feeling, I've taken a deep breath and thinking, yep, I've had a nice productive day at work, and there seems to be harmony and good vibes within the workspace.
Yeah, it's interesting. Almost without fail, whenever I run workshops and first expose people to the framework, I invariably have people saying, oh my goodness me, this is so relevant to, I can see how it's relevant to work.
Yep.
I need to go and tell my husband or my wife or I need to speak to my, my sister or or what have you, because this is, so relevant, because it's just talking about, as I say, emotions pervade all parts of our life, sort of every moment of it. You walk out the door and you see someone who you have who you like for whatever reason. There's a positive emotional response.
Yeah.
Your phone rings and it's Pete Muling. Oh, for crying out loud, what a pain in the backside he is. We have an emotional response immediately, and that can then dictate how we ultimately respond and cope.
Yeah.
So this it's ever present.
Yeah, true. What do you reckon the one thing is that you'd like people to be clear on after listening to this episode?
I think that the fact that often a negative emotional response is our default to difficult circumstances. So we don't beat up on ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
We do often have a choice, though, how we ultimately respond and cope. And that if we stay stuck in a negative emotional space, it's not good for us. And I think often it creates an internal tension. We behave in a way that ultimately we cope and respond in a way that might be negative, but I don't think we ever feel at peace with that. But whilst that negative emotional response might be normal, we can actually choose an alternative. And I don't have to stay in a place of, victimhood or blame. I can go, okay, what do I need to do about this? Yes, it's a problem. Yes, it's painful. But what can I do about this? How can I take responsibility? How can I support, the other person who might be causing me this grief to take responsibility and support them to be better? And if they're better, it's probably going to be better for me. Mm-hmm. So there's very much a case of, yes, we often react negatively to difficult situations. There is an alternative. We can make a choice, and that's very liberating.
Yeah. So, Pete, as I've told you on numerous occasions, but I'm going to reiterate that to the listeners here, that you've come in and helped us in our practice, and it was an invaluable exercise. I never saw us there being too many problems in our practice, but I also felt that there were some blind spots there, and Joe and James being brothers in a practice, and it was very, very useful. And we continue to use that dynamic and organic way of being able to chat to each other about getting better. And it does come in the spirit of that. So, appreciate you coming on. As a small, a bit of a different question. I want you to fill in the gaps. Hawks, Premiers?
Not for a long time.
You're not going to give us a date?
Oh golly, it's just getting harder and harder, isn't it? All right, I'll give you a date. I'll say 2026.
Wow, that's optimistic. Maybe an easier question to answer. What sort of spirit animal would you be, and why? And you can't be a hawk. That's off the table.
What sort of spirit animal?
Yes. What animal would you be? Why? And why? Yeah.
Oh boy. Gee whiz, Joe. I'll say an eagle. Just that hopefully that capacity to be able to fly high and just be able to see what's going on beneath you and hopefully respond in a way that's be able to effective for those you're looking after.
From a macro point of view, that's good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, again, Pete, thanks very much for coming on. Again, so many great things to take in, and good luck with your crusade. And we'll chat very soon.
Good on you, Joe. Appreciate it.
I hope that this one was enjoyable to listen to and there were some moments of value. If you have resonated in any way with the sentiments of this podcast, we would be delighted to direct you to our website, www.itsneveraboutmoney.com.au, for more free resources and education aimed at improving your capacity to make sound financial decisions for the benefit of your family. We wish you every success, however you define it.